Welcome to our first SIGTalk on IT operations. It's a new program that we launched at the end of last year to bring content in a little different format for you to be able to give you quicker, real tidbit, end-user customer experience type conversation. And our focus today is going to be on ITSMA and hybrid cloud management, two areas that fall into the IT operations suite of products from Micro Focus. And again, it's called SIGTalk. Kind of take off from what we see in the IT world with the TED Talk kind of things, kind of conversations that are but only focused here for Micro Focus community members, customers, partners, and Micro Focus folks. So we're kind of excited about kicking this thing off today with a couple of great presenters. My name is Rocky Pisto. I'm a Vivid Lug and SIG leader for as long as I can remember, maybe too long. And but I'm excited about presenting this to you today and supporting the Vivid community. Our speakers today are some established, well-known companies that have been working in the former HPE world and now in the Micro Focus suite of products. Eric Kruger, Principal ITSM Consultant from Stratacom, been doing that for a long time. He's done a ton of implementations in that space. David Andrani, I have trouble with Italian names, sorry David. Being Italian, I can't figure that out. Senior Director, Sales and Business Development at Coda. And I don't think Troy's presenting today, but he's on the technical side as well for Coda and kind of responsible for some of the content that we're going to be seeing today. So a little housekeeping. This is a live session. If you want to kind of expand your view of the slide so you're not seeing any other panels, you can see where the red arrow is there. You can expand your screen and open it up at that point. Pretty easy to do. Secondly, we have a Q&A panel, and you can ask questions there. And as we kind of go through the presentations or, where it makes sense, we'll try to answer some of these questions. We hope to have some time at the end as well to address questions. This is an opportunity for you to kind of kick the tires with the experts and ask things that might be relevant for you and what you're doing with the tools in your space. Secondly, if you're on this call and you're from other than the Americas or the UK and you would like to ask questions, you can kind of click that little blue button where you see the American flag currently and connect to the language that you speak, and you can type in the question in the language that you speak. And for us in the US that may have to answer the question, we'll see it in English. So kind of a neat tool to take advantage of to kind of bring us together a little bit better. And introducing today, if you've got questions and you want to send it through Twitter, feel free to do that. Hashtag Vivid SIGTalks. So kind of something new. It's another great way to interact. And we'll try to answer the questions either here or after the recording has been done. And it'll be part of that solution set when we send you the email that includes the presentation and answers to all the questions. So just a little bit about the SIGTalk around IT operations. It's designed to share best practices. Ideally, we'd love to have you as practitioners share some interesting things that you're doing with the tools in the following categories, as you see on the slide. Anything new upgrades, or your experience during an upgrade or integration with other tools, something that you found that, would really help other people that are using the same technology or planning to do, for example, an upgrade of one of these tools in dealing with, the myriad of issues that can come up in a heterogeneous environment. And I think it's a great way for you as a practitioner, get exposure to the community and share, your thoughts with your peers. And again, the networking is just phenomenal. You get 100, 200, 300 people listening to a presentation or experience that you're doing. It's good for career activities, and it's good to make sure that Micro Focus knows you are around at your company doing these kind of things. So I think it's, in my 20-some years as being a Vivid member, the best thing that has happened is that people that have made this their career get the exposure to network with their peers and share their thoughts and feelings. So we do these things every month. And again, we're looking for something in the 12 to 18-minute range. You can kind of do a demo. You can give us a therapy session on your experience on working with an upgrade or a migration or just whatever thoughts you have that you think might be valuable to the community. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me, rocky.pisto@vividworldwide.com. So here's today's agenda. Everything you need to know about the Micro Focus ITSMA container concept. Containers, I think from my understanding and hearing from a lot of folks, this is kind of starting to separate Micro Focus from the rest in the concept of containerization. So Eric should give us some good insight into that technology and how it works with the service management tools. And then the second presentation is around a real migration from the hybrid cloud solution. And that's the team from, Troy and Dave. So feel free to ask questions, put them in the question panel, and we'll try to make this as interactive as possible because that's the best way we learn. And I think with that, I'm handing it over to Eric.
All right, thanks, Rocky. So today I'm going to be talking about the Docker deployment of the ITOM suite from Micro Focus. Our agenda, I'm going to go over the underlying technology. The two main ones are Docker and Kubernetes. What are they? How do they start? How old are they? What are the advantages of these technologies? How has Micro Focus utilized these technologies? And then a container deployment methodology versus classic deployments. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then how will future upgrades be affected? So what is Docker Kubernetes? So these are the underlying technologies around the container. So I'm just going to talk and give you a little background on these technologies so maybe you'll understand a little bit better where they came from and what the advantages are. So Docker is a company that's driving the container movement across the enterprise. It was officially launched March 13th, 2013. And Kubernetes is an open source platform developed primarily by Google, and it is for managing containerized workloads and services. And this was released officially July 21st, 2015. So you can see both of these, it's 2018, so both of these technologies are still fairly new. They've only been around for a few years, but the adoption rate on these is incredible. So most of my colleagues or friends that are developers, like straight up Java or .NET developers, are using these technologies in a lot of their new projects. So, and they really were started by developers developing applications and wanted to deploy them more easily. So the adoption really has taken off from the development side. So what are containers? So container image is basically a lightweight standalone executable package of a piece of software that includes everything it needs to run. It's got the code, the runtime, the system tools, system libraries, and the settings. So containers isolate software from the surroundings. So for example, differences between development and staging environments, and it helps to reduce conflicts between teams running different software on the same infrastructure. So basically, you can deploy containers to your dev, your QA, your production, and you don't have to really worry about what's the underlying hardware look like, or what's the underlying software look like. Do I have the right packages loaded on there? Do I have, in the Windows world, is IIS set up right? All these different things, because everything that you need is contained in the containers. And this is just a screenshot right off a Docker website of explains a little bit how the containers might look and what's in the containers. So you can see that these containers are all running on top of the same kernel, the same operating system. The first container's got Tomcat, Java, and Debian. The second container's got PHP, MySQL, and Ubuntu Linux. And the third container is static binary and Alpine. And they're all running on the same kernel. So all three of these containers could run on the same machine with these myriads of software. So, one of the big advantages is that you can share hardware across these containers and not have the conflicts that you would running these applications on the same machine independently. So what are some of the biggest benefits of containers? Well, they're lightweight. So containers share the underlying operating system kernel, and they use less CPU and RAM than apps installed on individual machines. So like in the ITOM instance, you can share underlying operating systems resources that normally you wouldn't be able to. So maybe you would never load the web tier and the service management RTE on the same box in production. But with containers, they can run on the same machine, and they'll actually be spread across multiple machines. So perhaps you might have 5 production servers, and those 5 production servers might all be running the web tier and the service manager RTE. But they're all separate. They don't even know that each other exists on the same hardware. Standards. So they're all based on open standards and run on Linux, Microsoft, and cloud environments. So it's really helpful for deployment of applications because you can deploy applications across Linux, Microsoft, and cloud. And there is some conflict between Linux and Microsoft. They're still working out. And I had some slides on that I actually pulled out for this presentation to keep it short. But if you're interested in that, there's a lot more information out there about running Microsoft and Linux containers on each other's operating systems. So insecure. So Docker containers isolate apps from each other and the underlying infrastructure. So Docker containers, the underlying infrastructure doesn't really even know what's in the Docker container, and there's no way from the underlying infrastructure to get into these Docker containers. So malicious applications on the underlying infrastructure can't really affect these Docker containers. They can't get into them and see what's in them. They really are isolated from the infrastructure and the operating system. And also, if there's some malicious software in the container, it doesn't really have access to any of the underlying infrastructure's, say, operating system files or hardware. So there's no way to format a disk or delete files from the underlying operating system from these containers, because these containers just don't know that that the hardware exists underneath them. So how are containers different than virtual machines? Because virtual machines is what most people is running right now, and containers is a little bit different conceptually. So on a virtual machine, the software must be installed on each server. All the prerequisites must be loaded on each server for that software. Conflicting software can't run on the same machine, and each additional software install requires a new OS, waste CPU and memory. In containers, instead of booting an operating system, you just start the container, so that they do start quite a bit faster than virtual machines. In the Docker environment, only the Docker software must be installed on each machine. And like in Linux and Microsoft, it's a very, very simple, a lot of Linux distros come with Docker installed. Microsoft, it's PowerShell script to install Docker, so it's very little software to install. It's almost part of a standard build. So if you're building a big Microsoft infrastructure, you would just have a very lightweight kernel with the Docker installed. And Linux, you can have also very lightweight kernel with the Docker package installed. Conflicting software can run on the same hardware. So if you've got 2 pieces of software, especially on the Linux side in the Java world, a lot of times you'll have software that cannot run because they need different versions of Java. Well, Docker containers, they can run on the same machine because the version of Java that they need, or the little bits of Java that they need, are actually bundled inside of the container, and you don't have to worry about mismatching your Java versions. Even multiple instances of the same software can run on the same machine. So you can have different versions of the same software running on the same machine because they're not crossing up DLLs and Java jar files and things like that. Software prerequisites are packaged in the containers and do not need to be loaded on the underlying machine. So instead of building a separate machine for each application install like you do kind of in the virtual machine world, basically you're just deploying a Docker package to that machine or a single machine until you run out of resources, basically, and then you build another machine and deploy Docker packages to that. So it's just a lot more efficient. So why do developers love containers? So it's super easy deployment. So I can write let's say a .NET app and deploy it to any Windows server running Docker, Azure, Amazon, AWS, etc. There's not a lot of setup as long as the environment I'm deploying to is running Docker. My app will run because everything is in my application. It is in there. So if I deploy to Amazon Web Services or Azure or a customer's site, as long as they've got, for this .NET app, as long as they've got Windows running Docker, it will work. So it's pretty amazing for deployments. It really shortens deployment time a lot. And no more installing all the prereq software needed by each machine. You just deploy the Docker container. So it's super easy for deployment. Same thing with Java apps, and kind of the same concept for these micro-focus applications. It's a little bit different. I'll get into how micro-focus uses Docker in a little bit, but the underlying technology allows for super easy deployments. This is just a little screenshot of the old way where applications run on the host and the new way of on the right where we deploy containers. So on the left, if you look, you've got your applications running on top of your libraries, sitting on top of your kernel. And you can't have applications that don't work together. They have to share the same set of libraries. So if you've got newer or older libraries sitting on top of your kernel, say your Java version or your .NET version in Microsoft, that right version has to be there on that machine. When you deploy containers, your apps and your libraries are deployed together on top of with the container on top of the kernel. And they are lightweight. They do use the underlying operating systems, very basic core, say file system services, for writing log files, all those kind of low-level API type services. They do pull out of the kernel and use those. So it's pretty slick. You don't have to have those in your Docker containers because if they're in the kernel, you can use them in the kernel, which makes the Docker containers more lightweight. So what is Kubernetes? Kubernetes is basically a container-centric management environment. It does the orchestration between computing, networking, the storage infrastructure on behalf of the user workloads. So Kubernetes is not a traditional all-inclusive platform as a service system, but it does provide some general availability features common to PaaS, such as deployment, scaling, load balancing, logging, and monitoring. So Kubernetes is important because Micro Focus uses it pretty heavily in their deployment of the ITOM suite. In fact, most of the management that you'll do of the ITOM suite, you'll do via Kubernetes. So how is Micro Focus utilizing Docker and Kubernetes? So the applications are being containerized. So they're taking the applications that they've got, Service Manager, uCMDB, all the chat service, the collaboration, all those applications are being containerized. Each container contains a microservice, i.e. the Service Manager RTE, the chat UI, the chat service. They're all little microservices. And when you deploy this, you'll see you have to log into Docker site and download these containers from the Micro Focus Vault on Docker, and you'll see there's like 110 microservices that download. So every little piece of executable code has been broken off into its own micro service, and of course they're all orchestrated with Docker or with Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is used to link all the microservices together. So deployment of the suite includes all the microservices integrated and working. So that's one of the beauties of deploying with Docker. So you can deploy with a single, like if you look at the demo system, deploying a demo system, you can deploy Service Manager, Chat, Service Portal, uCMDB. You can deploy it all at once to basically 2 servers, kind of the minimum is 2 servers. So you can connect to an external, like Oracle database from there, or use an internal database, a Docker, a containerized database, but you don't have to do all the installs of all the different products. You can basically just deploy them all right from one little website on the machine. So what's the process? I'm just going to go over the process to install the ITOM suite so you can kind of see the steps. So if you're thinking about deploying this containerized version, what are the steps that you're going to have to do to get this to work? So you deploy the requisite number of Linux servers. So right now, the containers really only run against Linux. So all the containerized processes are run on Linux. We're a Microsoft shop. Basically, we run Hyper-V. So I'm running Linux on top of Hyper-V, and it works fine. So I think eventually, probably in the next year or so, you'll see Microsoft support of native Linux Docker containers right on Microsoft. Just the way that Microsoft works with Docker containers, I can see that coming pretty easily. So you deploy that number of Linux servers. The minimum's 2. You got to have 2 of them at least. Then you download and install the Container Deployment Foundation on the primary Linux server. So the CDF, I'll refer to it as the CDF, is basically Micro Focus's deployment, the way that you can deploy these Docker containers in Kubernetes. So you need to download that CDF because it contains all the scripts and everything that you need to download the Docker containers and deploy the Kubernetes and deploy the Docker. It has all the scripts in the CDF. So you deploy the CDF to the worker servers via the CDF web interface. So once you install it on Linux, there's a little install you run, creates a little web interface that you go in, and then you can deploy the CDF to your worker or secondary servers. And I tell you what, the newest version that was released in February, it's really slick. It's the best version of the CDF yet. Really easy to deploy to the worker servers. I've never had a problem deploying to the worker servers in this newest version versus the other versions, so it works really well. Then you download the Docker images from the Docker repository. So Micro Focus has their own repository. You have to get access to it from Micro Focus in order to download these images. And then once you download the images, you upload them into the container suite. There's a little upload image shell script you run, and then you just you fill out some NFS shares, and you click a button, and it deploys all the applications for you to Docker. So it's pretty slick. It's pretty simple. The time frame to deploy CDF, it takes some time to download those Docker containers, a few hours. If you've already got those, it takes the longest time actually is just uploading those Docker containers like into the CDFs, like memory banks, to be deployed. That might take a couple hours, but you can easily deploy, pretty easily, you can deploy all these things in like a demo system in a day, especially if you don't have to download the containers if you already have them. So advantages over traditional deployments, suite components already deployed, already connected to each other. It's especially helpful in like for Service Portal, for chat. I mean, there's a lot of these different suite components where if you're installing the entire suite, that you've got to install these things separately and then get them to work all together. You know, with certificates and lightweight SSO and all those things to get all these different applications to talk to each other. Well, that's already deployed via Kubernetes with these Docker containers. Resources are spread evenly between the computing resources. So normally lightly used applications like the chat service, you don't have to build a chat service server. Yeah, you don't have to worry about building specific servers for specific applications at all. You just build Linux servers. In the case of ITOM, you just build Linux servers and install the prerequisites on them, which really isn't very much. Like on the master server, you need zip, so you can unzip the install package. But there's really not much to install on the secondary servers. It's basically just your standard the Linux deployment. And everything is spread across those servers. So if you've got 4 servers, all the applications are spread across those 4 servers evenly. And you don't have to worry which one is my chat service server, which one's my Apache server for my web front end, which one's my portal server, or my uCMDB server, my service manager server. They're deployed across all the servers. And containers can be moved from machine to machine. So you can actually move, if you've got a machine that's running a high load, maybe some overnight uCMDB script or something like that, and it's interfering with service manager, these containers can be moved from one machine to the other. And you can even add machines. You can just start plopping more machines in and just start deploying to those machines to scale out. So really easy to scale out with Docker. You can literally just add machines to your pile and just keep deploying containers to them. So, very fast to deploy extra capacity. The containers don't have any state information, and you can just take them down and recreate them on any resource, and they'll work. They're not reliant on anything that's on the specific machine. So you can move containers around from machine to machine, and there's really nothing that they're reliant on. You've got static information that's stored on network shares, maybe on a SAN, but most of the ITOM suite information is stored in a database. So you're going to be storing most everything in a database. There's a few things that are stored on the NFS, but there's really not that much. Like I said, new resources can be added on the fly. You can add new servers during high use time without installing the application software. You just add the hardware and deploy the containers to it. So it's really slick. I don't have a lot of experience in the ITOM suite in like a high volume production environment and how easy it is to deploy. Like I don't know for sure if the containerized suite auto deploys to new servers based on usage, or if you kind of have to do that yourself. Still learning a lot about that, about how it handles high loaded servers, things like that. So some Micro Focus specific info. Most of the ITOM suite is containerized. There's a few exceptions. uCMDB, the Windows, the agent server, not containerized, is on the roadmap. And you can mix traditional deployments with containerized. So you can deploy Service Portal on Docker and connect with Service Manager in a standard deployment, or Service Manager on Docker, connect to uCMDB. So you can mix and match with traditional deployments and containerized. So I think pretty typical, probably the roadmap for a lot of customers is going to be deploying Service Portal on Docker, because if you want to run Service Portal, the newest version of Service Portal, you can only get it on Docker, on the CDF, containerized. So I think a lot of companies will probably start with that and then move into the other modules. So currently, SQL Server deployments of uCMDB or Service Manager are not supported. Only Oracle's supported. So, and part of that has to do with right now the containers are only deployed on Linux. So, and there isn't really a great solution for Linux to connect to SQL Server. It's just not. I know there's solutions for it, but it's just not common. So right now, Oracle is the only thing supported. Windows deployments are not supported for Service Manager and uCMDB. So like I said, they're only containerized Linux right now, and they must be run on Linux. So I'd say in the near future, if you're Windows, like a Hyper-V shop, probably you'll be able to deploy these on probably a very super lightweight kernel on Windows, and to be able to run the install for CDF. Right now, they must be run on Linux. But especially for an Oracle shop running on Windows, it doesn't matter if you're deployed on Windows or Linux or containers. I mean, you just connect to Oracle and they all work the same. It's all the same binary build. So you don't have to worry about, right now if you're running on Windows and I'm on Oracle, can I go to containers? Yes, you can. It's the same binaries, just deployed a different way in containers. Because the containerized versions are identical, you can move items either in containerized environment or move them out of containerized into a standard deployment. So, like I said, you can, if you're on Service Manager on Oracle, you can run containerized, you can run binaries on Linux, you can run executables on Windows, it doesn't matter. Just connect to your Oracle database. They'll all work the same. Things, INI files, log files, held in non-containerized places, NFS shares, Oracle databases, etcd files, Postgres database. So, and like I said, Service Portal, the newest version, only available in containerized. So this one right now is the exception. There is no standard build for this product. You have to run it containerized. CDF upgrades. Previous versions needed a complete uninstall, reinstall the underlying CDFs of the Container Deployment Foundation, so that there wasn't a real easy way to upgrade to the next version. So I've installed this February release, and it is quite a bit different than the other releases, and Micro Focus has said that the February release is the one where you will not need to uninstall and reinstall the CDF in order to upgrade to the next version. And I can see the bits that are in place for that when I installed it. It's kind of a different install process than the other versions, quite a bit different actually, and you can I can definitely tell what they're doing there to try to prepare themselves for upgrades without having to uninstall or reinstall. So for future upgrades, for most products, the upgrades are going to be pretty simple. You download the new Docker images and you just deploy them. So you don't have to uninstall the old binaries or reinstall or change your directory structure to copy the new old binaries in there. I mean, it really is very simple to deploy these. They have a little web interface to deploy the Docker images to download, and you just click the upgrade button and it upgrades them. So, of course, some products may need minor work for application upgrades. And Service Manager, you still are going to have to do your internal application upgrades. Those are getting easier and easier. I can tell you, going from 940 to 960 right now, I mean, the application upgrade is, there's just not a lot of code merging left that you need to do. So it really simplifies the binary deployment of the application. But if you do have some code merging to do, you're still going to have to do that. But a lot of the deployment issues for upgrading are going to be gone. And it's so easy to do binary upgrades in Service Manager. Maybe you're upgrading applications every 3 years or so. Your binary upgrades, whenever they come out, it's super easy to deploy. So a lot easier to deploy to testing environments, get it tested, make sure everything works, and just deploy to production. You can deploy in minutes, these new binary upgrades. So, and like things like SRC, you may have branding that may need to be migrated. If you're doing the SRC, SRC is kind of being replaced by Service Portal. So can you use your existing Docker infrastructure? I'm going to kind of speed up here, but basically no. You have to use the Micro Focus version of Docker and Kubernetes. So if you've already got a big Docker Kubernetes infrastructure and you're standardizing on specific versions, maybe you can, but you probably shouldn't use those versions for the Microsoft Focus suite. So there's some advantages and disadvantages. The biggest advantage is you don't have to have a Docker infrastructure to run this thing right now because everything is contained in the CDF and deployment. So you're not just deploying Docker containers to your existing Docker infrastructure. And if you don't have one, this makes a lot of sense. But if you're already a big Docker shop, you still got to use a CDF. So there's the upsides and downsides for different customers. So some final thoughts. Each version of ITOM has gotten easier to install and has had less install problems. This last version specifically is pretty smooth. Managing the CDF infrastructure is quite different than managing the standard deployment. So your infrastructure team, they might have a learning curve in order to manage this versus just managing binary sitting on Linux or Windows Server. And if you do have some Docker expertise, you're definitely at an advantage just because the Docker and Kubernetes commands to get logs and things like that are standard. So you can use that knowledge to do management of these Docker containers. You can kind of manage them just like your other Docker containers. So if you do have that experience, that'll really help you. So if you have questions, my email address is there. You can email me questions after if you want.
Eric,
I don't mind.
I've got one quick one for you. So is there any reason is there any reason why I shouldn't be going to Docker besides the the platform compatibility issues going forward?
So was the question, is there a reason why I should or shouldn't go?
Shouldn't. I mean, why wouldn't anybody move into the new Docker approach to making, it seems like it's going to be much more secure, easier to maintain, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think the biggest reason is if you're not an existing Docker user, simple things like monitoring, is the application up or not, may change in your environment, depending on how you're monitoring it. So if you're monitoring a Windows service, say, or a Linux service with monitoring tools, that's probably the biggest change from an infrastructure side, is monitoring this whole thing, because now everything is in containers. So it depends on how you're monitoring. If you're monitoring with API calls, basically, to see if things are up, that'll work the same. But if you're monitoring by looking at like ps-ef on Linux or services on Windows, you'd have to change your monitoring. So that's probably going to be the biggest leap. The other thing would be is if you're 100% Windows shop and just don't have any Linux expertise, these only run on Linux, and you do need some Linux expertise in order to get it installed, things like that. So if you don't have any Linux in your environment, it would be a pretty big jump. But other than that, everything else is better. But so some underlying infrastructure issues, but other than that, I would definitely recommend going to it if possible.
Great. That's a great way to kick off our first SIG talk. So I appreciate it, Eric, and we'll move on to David.
Great. Thanks. Thanks very much, and I appreciate everybody taking the time today. So the focus of my time is going to be in the area of hybrid cloud management. And, as I was thinking about what are the sort of content that we want to share, it kind of occurred to me that, there's a lot of noise out there, and a lot of opinions, and a lot of different, vendor offerings in hybrid cloud management. And so what I wanted to do is, and what I did do is really focus on, looking at a lot of the projects that we've delivered over the last several years, and kind of really pulling out best practices, and just what are the things that we've seen the most successful customers do in this area. And then hopefully help you with, putting together somewhat of a roadmap and a journey, and, with some use cases filled in of, what's the best approach. Because I think at the end of the day, every customer is going to implement hybrid cloud very differently. But I think as you'll see from this presentation, there's a lot of commonalities in regard to the sorts of things that you should be doing, or at least thinking of doing as you kind of go through this kind of journey. So a couple, I think, big areas that I want to really touch on, more than a couple, or what are the most common challenges that we see out there as it relates to hybrid cloud and moving down, and hopefully a lot of the folks here might even be able to relate to this. The first and one of the biggest is, people just don't really have visibility into their applications and its dependencies. As much as there's some really well-developed technologies out there to do this, most customers just don't have good visibility into what's connected to what. And that's a real challenge as it relates to driving hybrid cloud, especially when, you have very, very complex environments. How many of you folks out there, have invested in tooling, you're using different clouds, you have lots of different applications, just being able to try and pull all that stuff together to drive a hybrid cloud strategy is exceptionally difficult. And the other big thing we see is, everybody's automating. When I first started in this business, at Opsware, which a lot of the technology is based on, 12, 13 years ago, automation was really to some degree new in terms of bringing in automated tools. But now, in 2018, everybody's automated to some degree. But even though they've automated, there's still a lot of manual effort. We still see a lot of manual work and custom integrations that are getting done, and there's a lot of tribal knowledge out there. As much as people have invested in automation tools, it's amazing to me how much tribal knowledge still exists out there. And because of that, it's created really siloed support teams. And as you look through all these different challenges, I'm sure one or more may be applicable to all of you guys, but all of these, at the end of the day are foundational things that need to be solved before you can get through kind of a hybrid cloud, and hopefully this will help you kind of go through it. So I'm going to jump through a couple real quick high-level slides that I think are really, really important. And as we've evolved, as our business, and what we've seen with how our customers have adopted this technology, up at the top here, in the red, we've done a lot with automation orchestration. And what we ended up finding was that you really needed to get deeper down into it to be able to kind of help and drive a hybrid cloud strategy. And so the first step of all of it always is got to be the assessment. And I'm pretty certain these slides will be made available, and we're happy to share. But what's most critical with any hybrid cloud strategy is just kind of getting that fundamental as-is state, right? What's connected to what applications are out there? Because the last thing you're going to want to have is you start building or you start migrating applications, you start moving these workloads into the cloud, and now suddenly the ability to kind of drive good services for the customer degrades, right? I mean, I don't know how many times we've seen customers just haphazardly take an application, move it into the cloud, and suddenly all of our users are screaming because the performance is so slow, because they never really took the time to get an understanding of, what were the application's dependencies, how much data is flowing back and forth. I mean, do we even have a big enough pipe to be able to support this sort of a strategy? So we see a lot of very failed hybrid type engagements, mainly because they never really took that first step of getting an understanding of what's connected to what. There was no documentation that was ever created to be able to help with, figuring out what are the right ones, which are the right workloads that are ready to move to the cloud. And if you skip this first step, I think what you'll find is as you move to multiple cloud providers, it's just going to remain silos inside the organization again. And you're just not going to be able to create a real hybrid cloud story. You're just going to be forced managing silos, and many of you may already be seeing some of this stuff today. So these are some slides that, as we talk to customers, that want to go hybrid, and it's typically because they have developers or someone like that they're building applications, they want to run dev tests, they want to build SaaS-based applications, they want to digitally transform, really whatever the case may be. What we find is that there's this unrealistic expectation that, the cloud's going to solve their problems, right? That bad IT process that they have currently right now is going to be fixed with public cloud. And as I'm sure everybody knows, it's definitely not the case. And we always like to say, look, hybrid cloud starts with private. If you're going to drive that sort of strategy, you need to make sure that you're automating way beyond virtualization. And I'm sure a lot of folks are already doing it. And when we talk with clients, they are doing it. Well, then they say, well, we've got scripts for this, or we have integrations for that, or we're doing all these sorts of things. Well, great. For you to truly be able to drive a strategy, you're going to start to pull this stuff together. You're going to have to start orchestrating these processes. You're going to have to start tying these different things together. Because the last thing you want to do is implement a hybrid cloud strategy and have terrible IT process. So when you kind of as a dovetail to what Eric talked about earlier around ITSM, that is a very critical component to the successful implementation of a hybrid cloud strategy. We're really big on our end of discussing change management and making sure that people are doing that stuff. But it's amazing how many times we walk into customers that just say they have these sorts of processes implemented, but then when we kind of peel back the layers of the onion, we realize they don't. And for any hybrid cloud strategy to work, you have to have private cloud down. You have to be able to automate and orchestrate at a high degree. And be able to high degree of competency and a high degree of repeatability, because just creating workloads in the cloud is not necessarily going to solve the problem. So how do we actually do that? So after we discover an environment, and you want it, and maybe you have your own tools, and we'll talk a little bit later about Micro Focus's tools, you really are going to have to get down to basics and start with basic blocking and tackling around automation and understanding and figuring out what are the pieces and the parts within your IT environment that you're going to have to automate to drive this greater strategy. And you see here, there's a number of different areas, right? From core infrastructure to the application to provisioning, of the actual virtual environment, the containers, to automating the process for application orchestration, right? Too often, we see people just get stuck with not understanding where to start. Well, what are the different pieces and parts do I need? How do I string all this stuff together? If I really want to drive a true cohesive hybrid cloud strategy, how do I do that? And that's where we always say, start with automation. Automate as much of that environment as you can and figure out which are the most important services that you're going to have to actually drive. Because ultimately, and this is my only marketing kind of slide that I like to show because it's a great HP, for those of you that have been in the HP software ecosystem for a while. I always loved to show this slide because at the end of the day, this is what you ultimately want. I want the ability to log into a portal where I'm going to have a bunch of customized services or semi-customized services that are going to be at my fingertips that will allow me to very quickly provision those systems. And they could be very, very complicated sorts of things like a full Oracle application stack, to something as simplistic as, hey, I just need some AWS infrastructure or, Azure infrastructure or something like that. That's the end game of what we're ultimately driving for. So some suggestions. So this is where we kind of get into a little bit more of the best practices that we've seen in very successful implementations with our customer base. So first off, you need to set up a secure and a solid foundation. Do your research on the different providers that are out there and know that there are fundamental differences between a lot of these different players. The way AWS does things is different than the way Azure does things, is different than the way Google does things, which is different than IBM does things. They each have their strengths. They each have their weaknesses. So what's critically important is to really fundamentally understand what are the sorts of services you're looking to drive and what are going to be the best cloud providers that are going to help you actually drive those. The second bullet there, running load tests and understanding not only what you are doing but what you can do. It is critically important to understand, your applications, how they perform, and then ensuring that workload gets placed in the right cloud provider, and know your limits. Too many times we've seen customers just stretch the limits of what they can possibly do or set unrealistic expectations for, their applications and their workloads and fail, or worse yet, create a whole bunch of downtime. We just recently saw a customer that came to us for help, that had a big SaaS application that, they built on AWS, but as soon as they started adding in more and more customers, everything kind of came to a halt. And the reality was this everything the way it was architected in terms of the application all the way down through the infrastructure was just done fundamentally wrong. And so they ended up not necessarily having downtime, but kind of stretching the limits of if we start adding in more and more customers, we may not be able to secure this. The other area is plan to scale. You really have to make the assumption that as you're building or you're migrating, these applications to kind of become more cloud native, to take advantage of those, different capabilities that are in the cloud, you have to build it to scale, not just at the application layer, but down at the infrastructure layer, and then identify constraints, and I love this line, identify constraints and build a roadmap to overcome kind of the stop dealing with it sort of approach, because we see time and time again, that, people go and try and solve problems with Band-Aids, that don't take into account the bigger roadmap, and then it creates more problems down the road. Server migration between providers is really, really important, right? We talk a lot about, containers and things of that nature, but it will be important that you take a good hard look at the tooling. And I'm sure everybody on this call has acquired any number of tools across any number of vendors that is out there. It is critically important that you do go through some sort of a tools rationalization exercise. There may be opportunities to consolidate, to get rid of, to potentially bring in different tooling, like a Micro Focus, for example, to be able to help you do that sort of stuff. We talked a lot about containers, or Eric talked about a lot about containers in the last presentation, and we see the same thing. Leveraging containers is absolutely a great thing. When when we talk to customers that are really looking to drive, better application performance, faster updates to their application, they're trying to be able to automate their dev and their test to be able to, drive their release cycles. Containers is one of those things that really helps drive that, and we are seeing much broader adoption of containers. And for the obvious reasons, I'm not going to rehash, the stuff that Eric talked about. But when you're looking at containers as a strategy to be able to, to drive hybrid cloud, what that will force you downstream is to fix all of those basic kind of automation orchestration issues that exist, right? It'll force you to pull all that stuff together, because for container strategy to truly be successful inside of an organization, you're going to have to bring that DevOps mentality to the table. You're going to have to think like that. And we see more and more customers out there that are finally bringing their app dev and their operational people together. And containers is one of those areas, where, yeah, it was developed by, mostly by developers, but we're now seeing operational people even drive adoption more and more. And I think it's important, as you're going to go down into that container strategy, that you also start taking a look at that underlying automation and orchestration capabilities that are out there. The other big area is very, very important. You really have to define your critical services. You have to look at all aspects of it from a security perspective. And that's going to help you determine your workload placement, right? Whether it's on-prem, off-prem, whatever. And that's where that assessment piece on the front end comes in as being critically important. Being able to help you identify what's connected to what and be able to understand what's the performance look like, so that, and also from a data perspective, do you have any sort of data sovereignty issues or security issues or HIPAA concerns or things like that? So it's real critical that you really sit down and take the time to define out those critical services in the front end. And the final bullet here from the suggestions, guys, I guess I really can't stress this enough because it's kind of near and dear to my heart, is automate, right? Automate and integrate everywhere you can. That will be the fundamental foundation that's going to get you to the hybrid cloud strategy, right? And this last bullet here I think is important. Custom does not mean manual. Too many times we see customers that just come out and start building out these funky integrations or these scripts or something that just will never, ever be scalable. What's critically important in a hybrid cloud strategy is we had one customer that called it the relentless pursuit of automation. You really do have to take that mentality and automate as much as you can, because the more you automate, when you start getting to a point when you're ready to release those as kind of cloud services, and I do kind of air quotes in front of cloud, it's going to be very easy to create those catalog items to allow it to be consumed by self-service. So I know this is a bit of an eye chart, and I apologize. We get a lot of customer questions around, we don't even know where to start. We don't even know what can be done. So what do we do? And so I like to show this because ultimately this becomes the foundation of a hybrid cloud, right? Build, triage, and request. Because at the end of the day, you don't necessarily want, it's just not about building stuff. It's also about the life cycle of it. So when I'm building servers or building applications or provisioning services, all of those services need to have a life cycle. They need to have a beginning and they need to have an end. And they need to follow specific processes. And that's where this use case slide comes in, is to be able to get you a fundamental understanding of what are the most common use cases out there. And the cool thing is every one of these use cases are use cases that have been delivered for customers. So these aren't just kind of made up, hey, we might be able to do this stuff. These are all best practices that we see customers actually implementing. So I want to finish off. So hopefully you saw from a roadmap perspective in terms of driving a hybrid cloud strategy, it really does start with assessment of an understanding of what you have. And just to kind of map it back to some of the micro-focused technologies that you guys may want to take a look at. The first one is the Cloud Assess. And the whole idea behind the Cloud Assess product is to do everything that I touched on. To be able to discover the environment, know what's connected to what, and actually be able to create a kind of a cloud migration roadmap. The other big thing it does is it can go out and there are technologies, I can't think of the name of the product, I can't believe I'm not remember it. Cloud Optimizer, I think it's called, where it'll actually go out, tie into Assess, and be able to kind of help you figure out where is the waste? I mean, how many times when you're doing an assessment, you go out and you find all this waste out there that can be reclaimed and you can save a lot of money. So I would definitely I would urge you guys to take a look at the Cloud Assess and the Cloud Optimizer product. The other cool thing that we're really excited about, especially with the Micro Focus, kind of merger of HP software, is now the ability to pull Platespin into this. Because really, if you're going to do a migration strategy and you're going to drive a hybrid cloud, you're going to want a fully automated way and a fully integrated way to get these workloads into the cloud, and that's exactly what Platespin does. And so if you look at how Micro Focus is now beginning to package up these technologies, they're now doing integration points between products that are very logically have to be put together. So Cloud Assess, integrating, that assesses the environment, then hands it off to Platespin. Platespin then can do the actual rapid automation of the migration of the environment. And then finally, the last piece, because I know we're getting on almost to the top of the hour, then is the management piece. So there's assess, there's migrate, and then there's manage. Because ultimately, to drive a hybrid cloud strategy or implement a hybrid cloud strategy, you're going to want to have some sort of a service catalog on the front end of this. You're going to want to have a portal that your users can actually go in and actually request these services. Now, these could be your own services that are being created. We've done a number of projects recently where they're using the service catalog on the front end, but they may be using different automation tools to actually drive all those automated builds. I mean, we've seen customers use, obviously the Micro Focus orchestration and DCA, those technologies. We've seen customers use Puppet, right? The DCA suite actually came out with a really cool integration with Puppet. So we do see a lot of customers doing that. We've seen technologies like Ansible that are out there and a lot of different open source technologies. Even in the AWS land, there's a whole bunch. So the beauty of the HCM technology is that you can still go out and reuse all of those existing automated builds that you've created across all these different vendors, even if they're not Micro Focus, and then be able to actually serve that up in a service catalog all in one place. The other cool thing with the HCM is that regardless of the vendor, so if you're going out to AWS, for example, it's got the understanding to be able to go out and see all the different services that AWS can offer and then show that up, right, in one single place. And the other beauty of all this, right, whether it's you use the Micro Focus technologies all as a suite or you kind of mix and match, you're going to be able to integrate with everything that you already have. And I think that's a real critical differentiator is you've probably all built some really good automation. Don't throw it out. You don't have to. You can definitely pull it in. Again, our most successful hybrid cloud management implementations are ones where we can reuse a lot of the investment that the client has already done. Because, if you think about everybody out there, these engineers and the consultants, they all have their favorite tools of how they like to do things. Well, let's not break that. Let's continue to get them to be able to operate at a high level, but then let's be able to reuse. Heck, I've seen customers that had both Ansible and Puppet in different teams within the same business unit. And then we were forced to use both of those technologies, which was fine, to drive a service catalog strategy. So I think that is it for me. Hopefully this was valuable. And like I said, it's, there's a lot of noise out there, and there's a lot of, different methods to actually do this. So hopefully this kind of helped with a bit of a roadmap and best practices to kind of help get you started. So with that, thanks very much.
David, that was great. Great learning from your experience and with what your company does in the hybrid cloud area. It's an area that's growing, and I think there's a lot of there needs to be a lot of clarification on where that goes, and I think you did a great job. So thank you. So just to close up the webinar today for our SIGTalk, our first SIGTalk, I thought it was great content. We've got something, what do we have here? We have a webinar coming up on March 28th in the DevOps area. So take a look at that if you're interested. Our next SIGTalk on IT operations is April 19th. We've got a couple more presentations in not in this area, but in some of the other topic areas. So take advantage of registering for that. We just made it live, I think, a couple of days ago. So click on that to get more of this kind of content from the Vivid community. Plus, at the end here, you'll be asked to fill out a short survey, I imagine, to find out if the content was relevant for you, and maybe if there's interest in other areas, feel free to send me a note, and we'll try to get that content. Or if you want to present, I mean, this is just a great venue to present to and to share what you've learned in your experience using the technology. One of my famous or favorite phrases that I use all the time is discussing the good, the bad, the ugly. So what went well, what didn't go well, what needs to be changed to make it go better. So I think with that, I want to thank everyone who attended today. I'm going to thank my presenters today. And with that, have a good day. Thank you.